When working creatively, I ask two questions. What do I want? And more importantly, why am I doing it? It's easier to point out the what, though it's important to spell it out when it comes to realizing it. But it's the why that makes any changes worth it or not. I've been making my own independent STEM-based creature collector, and I'll be revisiting a specific theme today. Light. In Final Fantasy III, a holy type was established to describe some spells that have always been around since the first 1987 game. Now this term would change names in later titles, some of which would call this the light type. This type is like a special ultimate type that's kind of placed above the others. Light here is divine. But in a different take, Yu-Gi-Oh! Literally separates the light attribute from the divine. Granted, they seem to share themes, and the divine cards are much rarer than that of the other attributes. But while divine now stands in for the ultimate category, the light attribute is now relatively more balanced. So what is the light type now? Apparently, Yu-Gi-Oh! Used to have a thunder attribute, but for the card game, the electrical monsters are called light. Despite electric and fire both being forms of plasma, they're often separated and associated with different colors and themes. But Yu-Gi-Oh's light attribute also includes the divine or mythological. I want to say that there's a bit of a celestial theme here as well, but that's often due to translations conflating holy and starry. Nevertheless, being related to spirits doesn't make one a light attribute on its own. So let's finally address the elephant in the room. Before there's light, it's often dark. The dark side and light side, yin and yang. These have been archetypes in multiple cultures for centuries. However, as an element, darkness seems to be more cohesive than light is. Let's try to explain why. So there's a narrative tool called a foil, who's a character that contrasts with someone else. So when you line a foil up to the other character, it's easier to point out where they differ. And some foils use something called a shadow archetype, where some internal aspects of a character are mapped onto someone else. In Jungian psychology, a shadow is just the parts of oneself that they didn't realize. This may include positive traits, but more commonly the shadow characters refer to primal urges, which in Freudian psychology is called the id. While the id is biologically necessary, it can easily come off as socially evil when exaggerated and unchecked, as it regards the self over others. So many shadow foils can be evil as they focus on the greed and violence, disregarding externally agreed upon rules. While it's easy to depict a shadow version like this, the opposite to these kind of shadow versions are yourself. There are a few games where there's a dark element, but not a light one. In Pokemon, the dark type was added in the second generation of their games. For 3 generations afterwards, there will be no dedicated light type. Mind you, the dark type was called the evil type in Japan, so the opposite of evil was more characterized with the fighting type, but by the 6th generation they added the fairy type, which harkens to some aspects of the light type we discussed in Yu-Gi-Oh! However, fairy's inclusion is often attributed to not a thematic need to balance the evil, lest the type would have been added much sooner, but rather due to the need to balance the gameplay. Pokemon's dragon type used to be the ultimate type that's kind of above the others, as they're initially exclusive to one line and resisted the starting types. But over time, more and more Pokemon will be dragon type, and competitively, they will start running the show. Fairy was engineered to counter dragon and other competitively strong types of the time. Before we continue this definition of light being fantastical, I want to mention how the celestial definition of a light type seemed to be mostly in Pokemon's psychic type. Whilst Pokemon doesn't need a new type, there's definitely room to reorganize a few for fun, as evidenced by many fan games. And if there aren't enough entries under a type, there's fun in making new designs to flesh those out. If the dark type's so cohesive, light is often defined as the reverse of whatever dark does. If we try to do the opposite of these evil characteristics, we get a theme about selflessness and being more virtuous. However, this coat of paint as an element easily veers from its true definition. The flavor of sweet, brightness, and purity differs from true virtue, as the former includes prejudice and better-than-thou arrogance, which sounds pretty evil to me. Nevertheless, lumping those in may make the element more easily classifiable in a combat setting. Also, when I say that light counters the dark type, it's not always about light winning over the dark, as some games have the types equally effective to each other, balanced, as things should be. Even Final Fantasy would later have an evil counterpart of said holy type, and they have the types effective to each other. However, if the dark type can promise victory through selfish and deceitful ways, what good can actual good do in a game with combat? Support. These characters can focus on mending or buffing your team over dealing damage. And there are many instances where support turns the tide of the battle. Support doesn't have to be exclusive to the type, but an element can lean towards a certain playstyle. After all, doesn't light guide others to victory? Well, why don't I finally tell you my thought processes when working on my project? Here are my reasons for not having a light type. So I'm making a STEM-based creature collector, and I previously covered a design I made called Photora, a photon-like being captured inside a camera. And they used to be pyrometalla that turns into electrometalla when observed. Metal because of the camera, and pyro/electro because those were the two photon-emitting types at the time. In systems that have fire and electric types, light really seems to no longer have a place. Like, a flashlight is electric. We call the sun and stars balls of fire. Honestly, is there any light that's not from electrons in a current or combustion? There's actually a lot. There's a bunch of chemical reactions that give off photons, and those reactions aren't necessarily burning nor electrical. In fact, even stars aren't actual balls of fire, as they're technically going under nuclear fusion instead of combustion, which we see in a campfire. Okay, but why don't I just call all these toxa? I have a whole type for chemical changes. Well, I used to have a chroma type to represent the variety in experiencing life. This was in contrast to umbra, which was about the lack of things, such as the lack of light. But there were two lines to challenge this colorful theme. I've dissected color in my past videos where the main takeaway was that there's a difference between emitting light and absorbing light while reflecting a specific wavelength back. My representative umbra stemma was Ventaworm, who's based off of super black, which absorbs more than 99% of visible light. But then there was a more troubling realization. Chromatos were representing cone cells, the very cells in our eyes that make us see color. There was this whole long, medium, and short wavelength reference in their clause, but look, red does have a longer wavelength, and blue has shorter wavelengths, that's true. But these cells aren't making those lights, they're absorbing those specific kinds of light. If I want to call these guys who absorb specific light chroma-typed, shouldn't Ventaworm, who arguably absorbs the most kind of light, also be chroma-type? What about lines that give off light? Are they also chroma-type? It was clear what I wanted to do, and why I needed to do so. Let there be a light type. Instead of dividing between the concept of nothing and everything, it made sense to distinguish between taking and giving. If Umbra is about absorbing energy, Luma would be about emitting it. A black hole has a gravity so strong that it can even pull in light, but there is something called relativistic jets that spew away from the black hole, where there is some plasma matter that's spun so violently that they're flung away from the hole nearly at the speed of light. Umbra isn't necessarily evil. The act of taking is part of life, but as the cycle goes, so is giving. There's also a fun correlation of id, ego, and superego in Umbra, Neura, and Luma, reflecting primitive desires, reasoning, and morality. The correct Latin term for light would be lumina, but I wanted to make it have the same syllables as Umbra, so that Ventaworm's still Umbra type, while Chromato, honestly, I'll probably call him Forta Neura, because there's an overarching story with sensors in Stemma, whilst Photora would be a Luma Metalla. I guess their signature skill could just alternate between pyro and electro damage, while still getting a stat boost if Photora uses it. Whilst going through the stemmas that will now be Luma type, there was the models line. I personally want to keep calling them Luma, even if axolotls don't naturally give off light. I guess they're metaphorically being the light of one's life, them being baby stem cells and all. So yeah, I've got a decent chunk of Lumas in the roster, and there'll be more stemmas as we go on. I coded a lot of the base mechanics, but I've been pretty stuck on the environment as of now. I plan on making a Kickstarter video for Stemma one day, so keep your eyes peeled and follow the channel to see more. I kinda wanna clearly go over the Stemma types now before the trailer, but that sounds like a video for another day. I first want to thank my Patreon supporters for directly supporting the channel, but you could always help me out for free by liking and sharing the video. Thank you for watching till the end, and I hope your days get brighter.